Alright guys, good morning. And for some of y'all, I know y'all are probably up at 3 in the morning watching these videos. So whether it's nighttime, daytime, I'm glad to have you guys back. The last time we talked, we were talking about the new imperialism of Europe in the late 19th century. And we talked about like the political and the economic and the social reasons. Well, what this video is going to be designed to do is really talk about how the Europeans, and when I say the Europeans, mainly England and France, is going to go and affect the western part of Africa, okay? So let's start it off. In the early 19th century, so let's say about the 1820s, because of industrialization, Europeans needed palm oil, okay? And they're getting this palm oil from African merchants. Now, like I said, they needed it for industrialization. It is essentially a lubricant for the machines. Now, in the 1820s, look, you got to understand, these Europeans, they're buying the palm oil from somebody, and it's African merchants. So we're going to see that African merchants are actually going to make quite a bit of money from the Europeans needing this palm oil. Now, this actually works out pretty good because a lot of abolitionists, a lot of missionaries saw this was a way of legitimizing trade with Africa. You know, for 3 centuries, it was the slave trade. That was what defined Western Africa. But now there's another commodity that doesn't involve slavery that the Europeans desire and the Africans are willing to produce. Now, although the slave trade in the Americas has died. And look, by the 1820s, it's, you know, you're starting to see abolitionist movements in the Western Hemisphere as well. Slavery is not going anywhere in Africa, okay? We're going to see that the slave trade in the Indian Ocean, on the east coast of Africa, slave trade into the Persian Gulf actually will increase. So the slave trade in the western part of Africa disappears, but it picks up in other places. Not only that, we're going to see slavery actually increases in West Africa because those landowners in Africa who are producing the palm oil, they're using slaves to do it. Okay. Also keep in mind too that, you know, even Arab landowners who are growing different spices, they're still using slave labor to produce their crops. Now, I want to mention this guy here because this is a good example of what could be, okay? John Africanus Horton, okay, 1858. He's a British doctor, and he wrote an essay about how these African kingdoms are changing, how these African kingdoms are reforming. And just like everywhere else we've talked about, whether it was the Arab world or whether it was in East Asia, he said that the key to these African areas reforming would be to introduce Western ideas, especially institute Western ideas of constitutionalism and having some type of representation. Now look, that being said, you know, 1858 is when he's producing it. We're not that far away from the scramble. So even though he's introducing that maybe these reforming kingdoms could, you know, use Western constitutionalism, it's only a matter of time for the Western European powers start to dominate Africa anyway, okay? All right, so let's talk about the British and we'll talk about the French. And then we'll talk about the reaction to it, all right? So, 1874, the British are going to attack the Kingdom of Asante. Now, you remember, guys, look, the Kingdom of Asante at one point was very, very powerful. It was a big slave kingdom. Well, no more slavery, no more insane power of the Asante kingdom. So, Benjamin Disraeli, the Tory Prime Minister of England, very imperialist, he goes and attacks Asante, okay? And look, the Asante army outgunned, outnumbered by the British. It's not even close. Not only that, the Asante kingdom incorporated a lot of other smaller kingdoms. And many times these kingdoms would ally with the English, okay? Or they were just easily taken over by the English, okay? So we're going to see that the British pretty easily take this area in West Africa. In terms of the French are going to expand their influence in West Africa. Okay? Now, you got to understand, with this, the French going in, we're going to add this extra component of Islam as well. Several of the African kingdoms that the French tried to bring into the fold, they're going to be Muslim. Now, most of these little areas, they're small, okay? These little kingdoms, they're small, and really they can't challenge the French directly. This is not Mali and Songhai and Ghana of the 9th and 10th and 11th centuries. These are small, little scattered kingdoms, okay? Now, that being said, something in addition to these smaller kingdoms having to deal with besides the French is there's going to be Islamic reform movements going on at the same time, okay? Now, these Islamic reform movements were actually spread by Sufi brotherhoods, with the variant of Islam is Sufi Islam. Okay? Remember, Sufi Islam is a little bit more mystical, preaches a closer relationship to Allah, very complex prayers, complex rituals. Also, the followers of Sufi Islam are very devoted to their leader. Okay? So, I don't want to say it's like a cult, but think of like, the devotion to a leader, and maybe they're being influenced by a leader as opposed to just going to the Quran. And that's going to have influence, okay? Now, the followers of Sufi Islam, especially in West Africa, they saw their version of Islam as the most pure. And it was the closest to what, Muhammad preached in the 7th century. So they're moving into the more remote areas of West Africa, and they're challenging the existing version of Islam. They saw the existing version of Islam as corrupt. All right, not that the people were bad, but they incorporated a lot of pagan practices, through religious syncretism, and they were like, no, this isn't exactly what, Muhammad had intended or Allah had relayed to Muhammad. Okay? So in response, we are going to see Sufi jihads going into West Africa. It is a struggle. It is a war to clean up Islam. Now, also, I don't want you to forget, you still got the French in the background here. We're going to talk about how they fold in a second. Okay? All right, so the man you need to know, the big reformer, is going to be Usman Dan Fodio. Okay? He is a jihad leader of Sufi Islam out of Nigeria. And essentially, he's going around to different areas, and he's demanding that the local rulers, the emirs, okay, that, they place their government in line with Sufi Islam, okay? They said, you need to do Islam the way I tell you to do Islam, because the way I tell you to do Islam is the most right. Now, of course, the emirs are like, don't tell me what to do. All right, so in response, they try to have him assassinated. It doesn't work, and it only causes more conflict. Okay, so we're going to see that, this becomes a war, and the followers of Usman Dan Fodio, they're actually going to conquer a lot of these smaller kingdoms, and they're going to create what's called the Sokoto Caliphate. Now, it's important to understand why the Sokoto Caliphate matters. From this point on, every jihadist movement from Sufi Islam is going to launch from the Sokoto Caliphate. They're going to bounce from that area. It becomes their launching pad. Okay? Now, finally, let's talk about how they fold into each other. In the 1870s, the jihadists and the French, they're finally going to come in contact with each other. They're finally going to come into conflict with each other. Okay? Now, the Muslim resistance was led by a man named Samori Touré. Okay? And essentially, Samori Touré declared himself to be the leader of the faithful, the leader of the Muslims. He is going to drive out the imperialists. Okay? Now, look, FYI, Samori Touré has no chance here. He is going up against a modern French army, okay? And look, he kind of knows this back in his mind. He actually tries to avoid conflict with the French as much as possible, but it's only inevitable. Okay? So we see that eventually Samori Touré and the French, they do come to blows, and the French just kind of wipe the floor with them. Now, Samori Touré does not go away. He's not like, oh, well, I guess I quit now. Essentially, they run to the countryside, and they start practicing guerrilla warfare tactics. Hit and run, not formal fighting. So they're practicing these guerrilla warfare tactics, but, like I said, inevitability will come. Touré is running out of guns. He is running out of ammunition. Now, his army does try to make his own weapons. He also essentially impresses the local population into fighting for him. But like I said, inevitability will come. Eventually, 1893, Samori Touré is captured, okay? And he is exiled from this area in Africa. And we see from this point on, the French do have solid footing in Africa, West Africa, okay? Lastly, let's kind of finish this up again with the English. The British. Their big area is in West Africa, and I guess it is a domino effect here. The British felt that their control of Egypt, and I know that's more North Africa, but follow me on this, okay? Their control of Egypt was threatened by the Sokoto Caliphate. So the British felt that their area is being threatened, okay? Now look, after the death of Usman Dan Fodio, the Sokoto Caliphate starts to break up, starts to decentralize, okay? And, you know, these emirs, these local rulers, they're building these walled cities, you know, and they're essentially trying to control the countryside. Well, this would be a perfect opportunity for the British to go put their power over the Sokoto Caliphate. It's all essentially decentralized. You can pick these guys off one by one. And look, that's exactly what the British do. Because they are decentralized, because they are vulnerable, they are able to be picked off one by one, okay? And arguably the emirs, if they just would have grouped together, maybe they would have had a fighting shot, but they didn't, so they got whooped. Now, in the next video, we're going to talk about Southern Africa, which will introduce the Dutch there too. So I'll see y'all in a second. Bye.